There are hundreds of abilities in Overwatch that can be damage amplified by various damage boosting abilities in the game. That makes certain attacks and abilities a lot more lethal, increasing the likelihood of you killing an enemy hero. However, what you may not know is that out of all the offensive abilities that exist in Overwatch, there are some that cannot be damage boosted whatsoever. Let's take for example Junkrat and 3 of his core abilities. If we try damage boosting his Concussion Mine with Ana's Nano Boost and Baptiste Amplification Matrix, it is capable of dealing up to 300 damage, making it possible to one-shot low HP heroes, also known as the Squishies. However, if we were to take one of his other abilities like Steel Trap and do the very same thing, the damage remains the same, even though both of these abilities work in a similar fashion. And same goes to his Riptire. No matter what types of damage boosts you try to use, it will remain at the same damage. And there are more abilities in the game that straight up ignore any sorts of damage amplifications. So, why is it not possible to damage boost certain abilities, and how much more powerful these abilities will be if they were to be damage boostable? In case you didn't know, in order for projectile shots and abilities to be eligible to receive a damage amplification, the damage boost has to be applied at the same time as hero uses an ability. And if you were to do a complete opposite, which is damage boosting a target after the ability has been used, it will not be eligible to receive a buff. Let's take a look at the current list of all the abilities that cannot be amplified, which is in total of 16 abilities. You may notice that some of them have an asterisk next to them, and that is because some of them can either be partially damage boosted or require certain conditions that need to be met. For example, take a look at Torbjorn and his turret. You might think that damage boosting Torbjorn would also indirectly result in turret also receiving damage amplification. However, in reality that is completely false. The only possible way to amplify a turret's damage is to, quite literally, by placing an amplification matrix in front of the turret, which might not be the most ideal usage of Baptiste ultimate. But hey, if Torbjorn has the overloaded turret perk selected, then it can be potentially a quite good ability interaction. And just like Torbjorn, damage boosting Ashe does not provide damage amplification to her ultimate. In this case, unlike the turret, you can damage boost Bob directly. These two abilities are called deployables. Deployable abilities are abilities that act independent from its hero, who also have their own HP, damage, and can be affected by some status effects like hack or freeze, and persist on the map until destroyed or run out of time of their use. Some of these abilities come with moderate to high damage output capabilities and can essentially sometimes act as a bonus player on the field. Since they exist as their own entity, or as I like to call them, DLC heroes, it means that whatever the player is doing or whatever the player is affected by does not affect their own properties. So let's take a hero that can spawn 3 of these DLC heroes on the map, Symmetra. Symmetra's turret is capable of dealing 30 damage per second, which you might think is not that much. However, when you combine 3 of them close to each other in a well-hidden spot, they can be quite lethal against some unsuspecting low HP heroes, dealing up to 90 damage per second. And in this case, there are no possible ways of amplifying damage of the Symmetra's sentries. Damage boosting sentries with Mercy's Beam or Ana's Nano Boost does not increase the damage of sentries before or after placement of the sentries, nor sending sentries through amplification matrix or lazy beaming through the football gates. But just because these entities are their own species, that is not the only reason why they cannot be damage amplified. And one of those reasons is balance. So let me show you what would happen if we completely removed the balancing reason behind these interactions and made it possible to indirectly damage boost Symmetra's sentries. How will these abilities change? Let's say we politely ask our Mercy player to damage boost us just before the match starts, and hide 3 sentries in a well-hidden spot that surely nobody is going to see. These sentries will now deal 117 damage per second instead of the usual 90, making it easier to kill certain annoying heroes like Tracer. And of course, we should not forget about Symmetra's perk that grants her a 4th sentry, further increasing possible DPS. But what happens if we replace Mercy's damage beam with Ana's Nano Boost and introduce Baptiste with amplification matrix and just send these sentries through it? This will then skyrocket the damage of each sentry from 30 to 75, or 300 damage per second with 4 sentries, which will make it possible to kill Tracer in about half a second and eliminate heroes like Reaper in just 1 second. Now imagine how worse this could get with some of the other abilities that we are going to cover just in a moment. But also, I forgot to tell you something important about some of these abilities. You see, if you've been playing Overwatch just as long as I have, then you might remember that some of these abilities were actually damage boostable before. One interaction in particular was so powerful that it had to be removed from the game. What you're seeing right now is something that you may still witness even to this day. a classic Graph Dragon combo, where you use Zarya's ultimate to trap as many enemy players as possible and then have Hanzo ultimate kill everybody inside of it. However, what you may not know is that back in 2018 and prior, Hanzo's Dragon Strike ultimate was eligible for all sources of damage buffs, most commonly from Mercy's damage boost, and sometimes even from Nano boost as well. The reason why this combo was used is due to the fact that the major counter to Graph Dragon was none other than Zenyatta's ultimate, which at the time fully nullified Dragon's damage by having equal heal to damage values. The damage buff from any of the heroes will result in Hanzo's ultimate breaking that threshold, resulting in a guaranteed team wipe. And in some rare cases, Nano boost was also used to further overwhelm Zenyatta's healing per second. The soft counter to Hanzo Mercy combo was Ana's healing nade. By nading your entire team, the Transcendence healing will be higher than damage amplified Hanzo ultimate. So in most situations, it was also common for Ana players to just try and anti-heal players inside of the Graviton Surge. The Graph Dragon damage boost meta was relatively short-lived, as everybody agreed that it was nothing but a boring, no-skill combo that basically relied on which Zarya and Hanzo got their ultimates first, and whether their Mercy player had their damage boost key bound to their mouse or controller. So eventually this interaction got patched, alongside some of the other abilities that you might recognize from earlier. So we can most likely say thank you to Graph Dragon meta for indirectly nerfing certain abilities and interactions in the game. However, there is one ability that they have most likely overlooked or didn't bother including on this list, which we'll talk about later. But for now, let's look at some of the other abilities and see how overpowered they will be had they been damage boostable. D.Va's Self-Destruct has the highest single burst damage in the game, capable of dealing anywhere from 100 to 1000 damage depending on the proximity to the bomb. The only heroes capable of fully tanking this amount of damage up close are Roadhog with the Vape and Hazard and Doomfist with their respective blocks. If we were to go back to the time where D.Va Bomb accepted damage boosts, we will be able to turn this Calfin baby into an actual hydrogen bomb, or in other words make it go from 1000 damage all the way to 2100 damage that not a single hero will be able to live through. And even the absolute minimum damage that you can take will also become quite lethal to all the heroes under 250 HP. So, as I've mentioned Junkrat Trap at the beginning of this video, how much damage do you think he'll be able to do with the amplified damage? Well, his base trap damage is 100. If we add Mercy damage boost, then the damage becomes 130. Still not enough to kill any squishy heroes. So, if we also introduce Baptiste amplification matrix, the damage will increase to 230, which now is enough to kill 225 and lower HP heroes. But if we want to take it a step further and make sure that we're able to one-shot Reaper and Bastion mains, then we have to seek refuge in open queue where we can have more support heroes with damage boosting abilities and just politely asking them to damage boost us so we can place a steel trap that does an incredible 310 damage. This is not something you will want to step on, that's for sure. But perhaps one of the most scary deployables that you can bump into will be Wrecking Ball's Mine. You see, the base damage for one mine is 165, which doesn't one-shot any heroes in the game. Oops. Which doesn't one-shot any heroes in the game. However, with the damage boost like Mercy, it does become quite lethal. For Tracer, that is. But we should not forget that there are 15 mines that are spread around the area, which at its default damage is capable of doing 2475 damage, or 3217 with Mercy's damage boost, or just 5197 damage with all possible damage buffs, which is enough to kill Primal Rage Winston 3 times. Oh, and just because I really love Widowmaker, Venom Mine with all the damage buffs will deal in total of 387 damage. EP. So, do you remember how I said that certain abilities that cannot be damage boosted can in fact be partially damage boosted? The AoE or Area of Effect projectile abilities are abilities that have two states. The projectile state, which is a small flying projectile with a set travel time that can be deflected and eaten by the enemy players. And the Area of Effect state, where the projectile, upon touching a surface of a map geometry or a player, transforms into the next state, in which case it cannot be further interacted with by any other players, apart from taking damage. What's interesting about these abilities is that they have two separate types of damage. Impact damage, which is only dealt upon colliding with the enemy player, and damage over time when the projectile transforms into a full AoE state. And interestingly enough, out of these two, only the impact damage can be damage amplified, while the area of effect produced by the ability becomes its own entity, fully independent from the hero who casts it, meaning that it no longer cares if you are receiving any sorts of damage amplifications from your team. Sounds familiar? So, hero like Torbjorn, whose ultimate starts off as a projectile, is capable of dealing 25 impact damage when it initially lands near the enemy hero, and upon landing it transforms into suspicious liquid, which then does 190 damage per second. Obviously, for balancing reasons, it was not made possible to amplify this damage, otherwise it could go as high as 589 per second, essentially killing any heroes within a second or less. But since the initial projectile still belongs to Torbjorn and is not yet independent from him, the impact damage it deals can still be amplified, going as high as 77. What I found interesting is how there is one ability that doesn't follow this rule: Mace Blizzard Ultimate. You see, it works in pretty much the same way as Torbjorn or Zarya's ultimate. You throw it, it starts off as a projectile and then transforms into an AoE state, minus the impact damage. However, this ultimate is fully eligible to receive all sources of damage boosts, which means that it is theoretically possible to kill full HP squishy heroes with a full ultimate duration. I cannot explain why this is a thing, considering how the previous ultimates work. So if you have any theory on this one, let me know. So that leaves us with Sombra and Sigma, whose ultimates are essentially capped at how much damage they can do. Fun fact, shortly after the release of Overwatch 2 in 2022, Sombra's EMP could receive damage boost, which as you might imagine was kinda OP at the time, which was shortly patched. So balancing wise, both Sigma and Sombra are capped at the amount of damage their ultimates can do. Just imagine nano boosting Sigma, who gets a 5 hero flux. It would result in instant death of the entire team. Well, at least the initial liftoff can still be damage boosted due to it being a fixed amount of damage regardless of maximum player HP, which again means that it is theoretically possible to have the initial liftoff to do 126 damage. So now you probably know why not all abilities in Overwatch can be damage boosted, and probably best if it stays that way, unless you really want to deal with Junkrat's Tire that is essentially a mini Diva bomb. Thank you all for watching.